All right, so what are our goals? Like I said, God bless you. We want to have the whole curve be within that therapeutic range, right? So that's where we usually target a certain CSS average. Does that make sense to everybody? So to make sure that curve is basically where we want it, we target a CSS average. And I will give you a little preview. What we control to determine what a CSS average is the dose rate. The dose rate. Not the dose, but the dose rate. We'll get back to that in a minute. So I talk a lot about what we control, because can we control the patient's clearance? Can we control the patient's kidney function? The patient's liver function? No, not yet, at least. What we control is how much drug we give, right? So we control is dose rate, and I'll define dose rate in a minute. We also want to make sure that the peaks and the troughs are not extreme, that they're within that therapeutic range. So we call this the peak to trough ratio. So it's the peak concentration divided by the trough. If your peak to trough ratio gets larger, that means there's more difference, right? And therefore it might be outside the therapeutic range. A smaller peak to trough ratio means there's less difference, and therefore more likely to be in the therapeutic range. Okay? So we want to make sure that the peaks and troughs are not extreme, which is your peak to trough ratio. Again, do we control the slope of the elimination curve? Do we determine K? Do we determine half-life? No, we don't. But what we can control is dose interval. So the rest of the discussion is going to be about dose rate and dose interval. Dose interval, you know that what that means, I'm sure, already. How often we give the drug. Is the drug given every 6 hours, every 12 hours, once a day, every 5 minutes, right? How often is the drug given? So we control dose rate and dose interval. The only thing we control is dosage regimen. Dosage regimen is made up of dose rate and dose interval. Good. So, what do we need to know to put together our dose regimen? We need to know the therapeutic range. We need to know what we're shooting for. We need to know what CSS average do we want to shoot for. What's our Cmax and our Cmin? What's our peak to trough ratio that we want to see? We need to know, what do we need to know about the patient? We need to know if the drug is cleared by the kidneys, we need to know their kidney function. If the drug is cleared by the liver, we need to know their liver function. We also need to know other drugs that they're on for drug interactions, right? We need to know all that stuff. Before we get too much, I want to talk about some more simplistic ideas on here and basically go into basic dosage regimen design. As I've said, I think about dosage regimen design in two pieces: dose rate and dose interval. Dose rate is your dose divided by your tau, or I usually symbolize it as DR for dose rate. But it's dose divided by tau. Everybody take a minute and make sure that you believe that. It's the amount of drug we're giving per time. So if we're giving, gotta think something that's easy to divide by. If we're giving 600 milligrams every 12 hours, what's our dose rate? If we're giving 600 milligrams every 12 hours, so if we're giving 600 milligrams of a drug every 12 hours, what's our dose rate? 50 milligrams an hour, right? Now, I hate dividing, and it took me a while to even think of something I could divide easily in my head. So I usually think of dose rate as the amount of drug you're getting per day, because multiplying is easier for me. So if we're giving 600 milligrams every 12 hours, how much are we giving every day? 1,200 milligrams every day, right? If we're giving 500 milligrams Q6, I don't want to divide 500 by 6. So how much are we giving per day for giving 500 Q6? 2,000, right? So we're giving more drug if we're giving 500 Q6 than we are if we're giving 600 Q12. And then if you do it per day, you can easily compare, can't you? And you can see maybe why dose rate is more helpful than dose. Is just knowing the dose very helpful? If someone says a dose is 500, does that give you much information as far as the dose rate, how much they're getting? It could be 500 a day, it could be 500 a minute, it could be 500 a month, having very different dose rates, right? So dose rate is the amount of drug they're getting per time, and I usually turn it into the daily dose. Dose interval, basically and again, I think of it as the daily dose. So the dose interval tells you how big or small of little pieces you're breaking that daily dose into, right? If you're giving that 2 grams a day and your dose interval is every 12 hours, what's your dose? 2 grams a day, giving it every 12 hours. 1 gram twice a day, right? So your dose is 1 gram twice a day. Pretty big bites. Or you could give 2 grams once a day. If you're giving it every 6 hours, you're giving 500 every 6. You get the idea, right? So over the whole 24-hour period, in all those cases, you're getting the same amount of drug, right? So I will jump ahead and tell you, your CSS average is going to be the same no matter how you give, whether you give that drug once a day, twice a day, or 4 times a day, as long as your dose rate remains the same. Okay? But what's going to change if you give it 2 grams a day, 1 gram every 12, or 500 every 6? What is going to change? The CSS average will stay the same, but what will change? The peak and the trough. Absolutely. If you give 2 grams once a day, you're going to have a relatively big peak and a relatively low trough, right? Because you're giving it as a big dose, and then it has a whole 24 hours to be eliminated until you give another dose, right? So your peak to trough ratio will get larger as that dose interval gets larger, right? So sometimes I use this, well, when I was a kid, we always had peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for breakfast, right? Or for lunch, not for breakfast. I actually like pickles in mine, which I know is weird, but it turns out I love pickles no matter what. But she would cut them into birdie bites, she called them. So she would cut them into 4 pieces. Now, I liked a square. I would go to my grandmother's. She would make it on the diagonal, which I guess is prettier in retrospect, but I was like, no, I can't eat it now. It's in triangles, not in squares. But did your mom ever do that? I know Dad cut your sandwich into little bites, little birdie bites. So I kind of think of this when I think of dose interval. So when you eat the whole, if you eat the whole sandwich all at once, what's going to happen to your sugar level? Whoop! And then it's going to come down, right? Until you get your next peanut butter sandwich and you eat the whole thing again, right? What if I instead, though, ate one of my little squares? So is my sugar going to go as high? Nope. And then I let it fall off. But now I'm hungry sooner, so I need another little square. And then another little square. So I eat 4 squares. I'm going to have less variance in my sugar level, right? So you're probably starting to see how we'll use this in dosing regimen design. The smaller the birdie bites, or the shorter the dosing interval, so if we went from Q6 to Q3 or to Q every hour, we're going to have less and less variance, aren't we? The peak to trough ratio will get smaller and smaller. And I like to think of it as becoming closer and closer to a constant infusion, right? Honestly, if we really wanted to make sure that patients suffer no problems with peak and trough ratio problems, no toxicity or lack of efficacy, how would we want to give every drug? Constant infusion, right? If we give it constant infusion, we can just target it to the concentration we want to have it at, and we're done, right? That's what we'd like to do. However, I've found that patients really don't take a kind liking to having IVs sticking in their arms all day long with several drugs running in, right? So that's really not an option. At least I always say not yet, because who knows, you know? With technology, I don't want to say what's going to happen. I have great hopes. But for now, people prefer to take their drugs as least often as possible, right? So we have to balance with our dose interval. What are we balancing? We're balancing, we'd like to give it every minute or have a constant infusion. That way we'd have the least amount of variability. But we have to couple that with what makes sense for patients, right? We know that if you have to take a drug more than once a day, it's pretty much not going to happen. Regularly, at least. It's going to be very hard for that to happen for the patient. So we have to balance that, don't we? Also, if the patient's in the hospital, how many of you guys work in a hospital? Anybody? If they're in the hospital, you know that every time a nurse goes in or the pharmacist has to make another dose of a drug, what's that going to do? It's going to take time, which is money, right? It's going to be much more expensive as you add more doses. That may be appropriate in some cases, but we have to weigh all this, don't we? So dose interval tells us how often we give it and how big the birdie bites are, right? How small the pieces parts are. Okay, we've sort of gone over this. So if we give 1 gram a day every 6 hours, the regimen's going to be 250 every 6. If we give it every 12 hours, 1 gram is our dose rate, then it's going to be 500 every 12. If we give 2 grams a day every 6 hours, it's going to be 500 every 6. And what I wanted you to see there, if you say the dose is 500, this gives you not enough information, right? So I usually like to think of it as figuring out what your dose rate is, because you're going to target your CSS average, and then figure out how big a birdie bites you have to break that daily dose into. Is everybody okay with all this? Okay, so we're going to specifically talk about dose rate. What does dose rate determine? I think I already gave this away. Dose rate determines your CSS average here. I don't know why, I just pretend that isn't there, that CSS min. For some reason, when I copied this graph, it only copied that. And anyway, dose rate determines, it's the only thing we control, determines your CSS average. What else determines CSS average? Well, you see dose rate there. I like to think of CSS average so that, because I am going to expect you to know this equation, because you're going to use it so much that you will know it. I think of it as drug in over drug out. Drug in, we control with dose rate, right? But if that drug does not have 100% bioavailability, you also have to consider, you all know what bioavailability is, right? You all